Welcome to today's genealogy program brought to you on behalf of the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center in Canyon City. Today is July 12th, 2025. I'm Jessica Ashton, and we are here at City Hall. So thank you for being here today, or thank you for tuning in on our YouTube channel. So today's topic is from Elixirs to Sodas, and Terri Meeks has put together a program for us. I'm looking forward to hearing about it. A couple of quick announcements before we dive in. Today is the second week of the Farmers Market here in Canyon City. It's down at Depot Park. They're at Royal Gorge Boulevard and 9th Street. And the museum and library are sharing a table down there. So head on down if you have time. They're open, I think, until 1, I think is what I was told. But there's all sorts of different booths set up down there. We'll be there every Saturday all summer with the museum and the library kind of rotating each Saturday as to who is representing down there. And then also coming up on July 24th, we've got a historic bike tour of Lincoln Park. And so that'll be a lot of fun from 5:30 to 7 that evening. And you can register for that at our website. So just hop on the website, find our calendar, and just follow the prompts from there. And then in August, we'll be doing a walking tour of downtown. So that's going to be August 21st. And the details to that will be announced a little later. So thank you. Without any more announcements at this point, I will go ahead and hand it over to our presenter, Terri.
Thank you, Jessica, and welcome everyone. This morning, we're going to talk about elixirs and how they evolved into sodas and what your family might have contributed to one of these industries. So let's start at the beginning. People recognized the medicinal properties of various things within the natural world. From cavemen on, people were harvesting things to either eat or use for medicinal purposes. And if it didn't kill you, it might have cured something that you had. So the first drugs that we're acquainted with did come in the form of herbs, plants, roots, vines, fungi. And it wasn't until the 19th century that these pharmaceuticals, these natural items, became more available. They were the only thing that were available. Colonists settled in the 1600s, and they brought the familiar plants from their home territory. When they planted their kitchen gardens, they included herbal remedies because they were out in relatively unpopulated areas. They had to rely on each other should a medical situation arise. When it came to new plants that they were unfamiliar with, it was the Native Americans that helped them to learn the properties of medicinal plants. Most of these plants were air dried. They were either hung upside down or dried on screens. And we still to this day frequently see herbs and other natural botanicals hanging to dry. So what did they do with these? They had various methods to prepare the natural items, and either for internal intake or for external application on your skin. So the first people that actually dealt in a commercial way with these herbs and were the apothecaries. And it was a well-established profession by the 17th century. And what's interesting to me is Nicholas Flamel, who appears in the Harry Potter stories. He was an actual apothecary in Paris. And his home, which was built in 1407, is one of the oldest homes in Paris. So he was considered a chemist and an alchemist as well. But he was mixing substances and he was selling his own medicines. And the thing that distinguishes apothecaries from others is that they had a fixed storefront. They sold their drugs from that fixed location. So when we come to the United States, Christopher Marshall was one of the first to open an apothecary shop. He was located in Philadelphia and he opened his shop in 1729. The shop actually operated for 96 years and went down through the family. He was a pioneer in the pharmaceutical enterprise, and he had a leading retail store in Philadelphia that was a significant supply depot during the Revolution. Not only did he mix the chemicals and sell them, he actually trained pharmacists as well. There wasn't a school available at this time, so he had apprentices and he trained them to be pharmacists slash apothecaries. His granddaughter Elizabeth, who took over the business, was America's first woman pharmacist. And here is a drawing of an example from his Philadelphia shop. So the Village Apothecary Shop, opened by Dr. Galen Hunter in 1838 in New York's Greenwich Village, is the oldest surviving apothecary pharmacy in the United States. It was bought by Clarence Otis Bigelow in the late 1800s, and he renamed it after himself. So in 1902, he moved from Greenwich Village to 414 6th Avenue. And during the Depression, he sold the business to William Ginsburg. And it is still in business. It is currently run by the fourth generation of the Ginsburg family. So in 1752, the Philadelphia Hospital opened the first hospital pharmacy. But it was quite a while later that finally the United States Pharmacopoeia was founded. And this was an organization that wanted to establish guidelines and standards of practice for the pharmacy business. And they had formal ideas and they established some training programs that would keep people in line. And it was finally the year later that the actual Philadelphia College of Pharmacy was founded. So by the mid-19th century, organic chemists began to isolate specific active ingredients in medicinal plants. Up until this point, the whole plant was used to formulate different medications, elixirs, tonics, etc. And it was these specific active ingredients that were now being isolated to make the medicines that we have come to know today. So we talk in our title about elixirs, and people were in search of the elixir of life. Supposedly, this was going to grant eternal life or eternal youth. And alchemists from the earliest time sought the means to formulate this elixir. The difference between an elixir and a tonic. Elixirs are botanical remedies that address a specific imbalance in the body. The body is composed of different aspects, and supposedly when one of these aspects gets out of alignment, you need some sort of elixir to get back into alignment. Typically, they're clear a liquid, and for the most part, they contain alcohol. They do add flavorings, and they do have some medicinal agents or vitamins in them, but the prime ingredient usually is alcohol. And as I said, they were used to treat a specific symptom. So if you suffered from headaches, you might want to go for one elixir, whereas if you had a cold or some other ailment, you would choose another elixir. On the other hand, tonics were formulated to fortify the body. They wanted to improve your immunity or boost your energy. So they were targeted more to the whole body and improving the whole body's resistance to those individual ailments. During the 18th century, English medicines and remedies were imported. When it came to the Revolutionary War, there were many blockades, so ships could not get through. So Americans had to rely on their own products. And after the Revolutionary War, the American-made products actually were preferred. And they did have the new market for homegrown patent medicines at this point. So what is a patent medicine? It originated in 17th century England, and they just did describe medications that were for the royal family. The term comes from letters patent, which was a grant from the king or the queen to an individual. And what it essentially did was it allowed them to produce their product and have a monopoly on that product. This whole idea was exported to America in the 18th century. So we see the growth of patent medicines. The first ones did arrive from England, and we'll take a look at them. The three that are listed here, they were sold by postmasters, goldsmiths, grocers, tailors, and local merchants. So I assume anybody that was willing to sell them would be able to have a market. So we look at Daffy's Elixir Salutis. It was invented by Anthony Daffy, and it was a popular medicinal drink, and it was a remedy for colic, gout, and toothache. And it says a famous cordial drink, and that probably should be cordial. A cordial is an after-dinner drink, a liqueur, so it has a lot of alcohol, but it has fruit flavors in it, sometimes herbs and spices, but it's a secret. We have Dr. Bateman's drops, and these were developed by Benjamin O'Kell around before 1711, and they were actually patented in 1720. It was popular for disorders of the chest and lungs, and it lasted for almost 200 years. It was still being used in the early 20th century. Dr. John Hooper's female pills. These were patented in 1743, as it shows on the cover of the box, and these were promoted as anti-hysteria pills. After all, women might be hysteric. So why were these medicines so popular? At this time, the early 1800s, mid 1800s, there were very few treatments for chronic or infectious diseases or illnesses. Doctors were costly. The medicines were not. People lived in remote areas, and these did not require a doctor's prescription. And I looked up to see when were prescriptions required. And it's interesting that prescriptions were written from ancient times. They did not become actually required until about 1906 when the Food and Drug Administration, their act came into being. So these drugs, these remedies, could be ordered through the mail, and they were marketed as cure-alls, whether they met their promises or not. With that alcohol content, they could provide some temporary relief. How did they sell them? Advertising. This was kind of the birth of advertising. They would get patient testimonials. Yes, it cured my this, it cured my that. And newspapers were very, very popular medium to advertise the patent medicines. In actuality, there never was a patent. So the medicines actually contained some very serious compounds: cocaine, morphine, opium, alcohol. And all of these gave that soothing effect. But for the most part, both the prescriber and the person taking the medication were unaware of the dangerous or addictive qualities of the patent medicines. Snake oil, which is a verifiable, effective anti-inflammatory. It was introduced in the mid-1800s by the Chinese laborers working on the Transcontinental Railroad. The oil came from the Chinese water snake, and this snake is unique to China. It doesn't work with rattlesnakes. But that didn't prevent anyone from trying. We have Mr. Clark Stanley, who came along, and he was a quack doctor who marketed a product for joint pain and rheumatism. And he became self-proclaimed the Rattlesnake King. At the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago, he actually pulled a rattlesnake out of a sack. He slit it open, placed it in boiling water, and the fat rose to the surface, and his snake oil liniment was born. He actually opened 2 production facilities, one in Massachusetts, the other in Rhode Island, and established a large mail order business. And he did rely on print advertising to attract business. His products contained no actual snake oil. I don't even think any rattlesnake oil, just mineral oil, beef fat, red pepper, and turpentine. I wonder who took this. So Clark Stanley was the man that became the first snake oil salesman selling his snake oil. He actually deceived customers for 2 decades. But with the passage in 1906 of the Pure Food and Drug Act, that act aimed to protect consumers from adulterated or misbranded food and drugs. The act made it illegal to sell those across state lines, and it required labeling of active ingredients in food and drugs, including substances like alcohol, cocaine, heroin, morphine, and cannabis. So this law came into effect in 1906. But it took until 1917 for the federal investigators to catch up with Mr. Stanley, and they seized a shipment of his liniment, analyzed it, and found that it contained no snake oil. He was only fined $20, but he paid his fine, he closed shop, and he slipped away to nobody knew where. And here is Clark Stanley, along with his bottle cover, his snake oil liniment. We also have Dr. Sylvester Andrew Kilmer, who in the 1870s founded a laboratory and his remedy company, and he too had cure-alls. And he was very, very popular. He actually had a marketing strategy, and his brother and his sons worked together to market the product so that Dr. Kilmer's swamp root became a household name. And we see his elixir as it was advertised. Hadacol dietary supplement. This is probably more a tonic. It was created by Louisiana State Senator Dudley J. LeBlanc, and as with many of the others, he had no medical or pharmaceutical training, but he founded the Happy Day Headache Powder Company. And it was discovered that his Hadacol remedy contained as much alcohol as a bottle of wine. So here again, this is 1938. So it's during Prohibition. So his dietary supplement was very popular in the dry counties. It was so popular that there was a song, Hadacol Boogie. There was a comic book, Captain Hadacol, and he too had a traveling show to advertise. And here's the comic book, and we see that the young man has to take a pledge, just like Hadacol takes their pledge to make everyone healthy. And we have a Superman figure. So obviously, by the late 1800s and early 1900s, physicians and medical societies are becoming critical of these medications. They recognize that they do not cure illnesses. And in some cases, they actually discourage sick people from seeking treatment. They caused alcohol and drug dependence. And the temperance movement, which had started in the mid-1800s, was very, very much against these medications. They protested the use of the alcohol in these medicines. Many of these medications, we saw the use of turpentine. We also realized that it caused problems with poisonings. When the Industrial Revolution came along, there were new drugs and cleansers, cleaners, pest control products were introduced. And many of these also contained some of the same items that were in the patent medicines. People at the time were, by and large, illiterate, and there were accidental poisonings, and deaths were common. They were also used in homicides and suicides. So authorities recognized this problem, and in order to address it, they came up with bottles in distinctive colors, shapes, and designs. They used dark colors in order to maintain the strength to prevent degradation of the medication as a result of exposure to sunlight. So that's why you see a lot of dark bottles. The amber bottle seems to be one of the more popular. The bottles also featured raised lettering. There were patterns, grooves, geometric shapes, and sometimes a skull and crossbones were used on the label of the bottle. And these were all to distinguish poisons so that people wouldn't mistakenly take one of the medications. At this time, one of the most popular medications was the sublimate pills, and these were highly poisonous. Sublimate was used in photography, pest control, preservation, and medicine. So, and it's commonly known as mercury chloride, and we all know in today the dangers of mercury in the body and even to touch. In early 20th century, it was an over-the-counter cure for measles and syphilis. So it was used as an antiseptic and a disinfectant. And there were many accidental poisonings, suicides, and suspected murders. And here is a bottle showing corrosive sublimate pills. We see the dark bottle for mercury salicylate, and this was used for treating syphilis. And we have friable tablets. And friable tablets, essentially, they could break down into smaller parts. So they could be crushed by a spoon or broken so that it was more, they were more easily given and administered to the patient. But it's labeled poison. So this whole idea of patent medicines and others developed the idea for advertising for traveling medicine shows. And it was surprising that these lasted well into the 1930s. They were sponsored either independently or by a medicine company. And for the most part, people were peddling the idea of a medical cure or miracle cure. They would put on minstrel shows or vaudeville shows to attract an audience. And these shows were usually free in order to draw the crowd, but then you paid to buy the medicine. In most cases, the pitchman who was selling this was often called a doctor or a professor, even though they had no medical training or other training. So we see Doc Randall's old medicine show with music for the Smith family. We see Professor Crookshank, and if that's his picture, he's a pretty scary looking guy. We have the genuine Kickapoo Indian Sagwa, the great Indian medicine, in a compound of the victims of the virtuous of roots, herbs, barks, etc. So we'll cure all of these ailments. And we see the huge crowds that showed up in these small communities to seek whatever relief they could find from these patent medicines. Let's look at some of these patent medicines that still exist as we have them today. They might have started out as patent medicines, but in most cases, they have been reformulated to remove the alcohol. So we have Fletcher's laxative. It was an 1868 patent granted to Dr. Samuel Pitcher, and it was a cathartic, and it was originally sold as Pitcher's Castoria. 3 years later, it was purchased by Charles Fletcher's the Centaur Company, and it was renamed Fletcher's Castoria. And the alcohol was removed. And we see some original bottles of Fletcher's Castoria. Carter's Little Liver Pills. They were formulated by Samuel Carter in 1868, and his trademark on his bottles or containers was a black crow. And the pills were supposed to cure headache, constipation, dyspepsia, and biliousness. So the name was changed in 1951 to just become Carter's Little Pills, since liver in the name was deemed deceptive. And we see an advertisement here, the wife holding her head. I don't see how it is, Frank, out so late as we were. You feel so bright this morning while I have this wretched nervous headache. Frank says, well, my dear, I take Carter's Little Liver Pills. No headache where they are used. Mentholatum. The Yucca Company started it in 1889 by Albert Alexander Hyde. And the whole company actually manufactured shaving creams and various kinds of soap, laundry soap, toilet soap, etc. And he introduced the ointment in 1894 after researching the effects of menthol. Menthol was used as a soothing element. So in 1906, the company was renamed after its flagship product, mentholatum ointment, and they produced the deep heating rub and lip care that we know today. And we see it used for sunburn and windburn as well. Smith Brothers cough drops. These were two brothers, William Wallace Smith and James Smith, and their father actually had opened an ice cream parlor in New York City called James Smith and Son. But in about a little before 1852, he bought out a cough drop recipe for Sly Wilkins. And he did this thinking that it might be a candy to go along with the ice cream. So in 1852, he made his first batch of cough drops. The Sons took over the business in 1866, several years later, and they sold the drops in glass jars on the countertop in the ice cream parlor, thinking more along the lines of candy. So to prevent sales of generic versions in case their formula had been stolen, they decided to package the drops in branded boxes starting in 1872. And here is one of the labels from their box, Smith Brothers cough drops. And what's interesting is underneath each of their photos, the word trademark is listed. People mistook this and they thought that one of the brothers' names was Trade and the other brother was named Mark. So Alka-Seltzer. This originates with the 1928 flu epidemic, and the president of the Miles Laboratory, heard a rumor that all the people at the Elkhart newspaper, they were all healthy in the midst of this flu epidemic. So he heard that the staff had been taking a mixture of aspirin and baking soda, and that those would eliminate flu-like symptoms. So he had his head chemist work to develop a similar mixture. And unfortunately for the 28 flu victims, it wasn't introduced until February of 1931, but it's what we know today as Speedy Alka-Seltzer. So let's turn to soda. Their origins can be traced back to both elixirs and tonics. They were created by pharmacists, and they were considered medicinal concoctions. They did contain the same cocaine and caffeine, marketed as elixirs to cure various ailments. And this is why soda fountains were historically located in pharmacies. They were selling medicines. One of the first ones that we have is Hires root beer. Charles Hires was on his honeymoon when he first tasted root beer in 1875. And the following year, he developed an actual recipe for root beer powder. It is interesting to note that most of these sodas started out either as powders or as syrups. They were not put in bottles and mixed in sodas as we know them today. He sold the powders at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition, and he gave away free glasses of root beer so that people could actually taste. By 1884, he was making a liquid extract and a syrup, which he sold to soda fountains. And it was advertised as a product that would purify the blood and make rosy cheeks. All the comforts of home include the great temperance drink, no alcohol. It gives new life to the old folks, pleasure to the parents, and health to the children. Good for all, good all the time. And 25-cent package makes 5 gallons. So be sure to get Hires, and everybody is drinking it. Moxie. Moxie was advertised as a nerve food. It was invented by a Maine native, even though he was living in Lowell, Massachusetts, Dr. Augustine Thompson, and it was produced as a syrup. It wasn't until 8 years later that carbonation was added, and his first bottle was sold in 1885. Here again, he started as a syrup, which went to a drug store. Interestingly enough, in the early 1900s, Moxie Nerve Food was the nation's favorite soft drink. Not Coca-Cola, not Pepsi, not Dr. Pepper. It's similar to root beer, but it has a bitter aftertaste from the gentian root extract. And that's one reason for the name Moxie. It takes a little bit of extra courage to actually drink the drink. So you had Moxie. It was effective against paralysis, softening of the brain, nervousness, and insomnia. And as recently as 2005, it is designated as the official soft drink of Maine, Dr. Thompson's home state. Be sure you always get the real drink, Moxie, and it is still sold today, but most heavily in New England states. Dr. John Pemberton. He was wounded in the Civil War, and as a result of his wounds, he became addicted to morphine. So he wanted to find something that would relieve his pain, but did not have the deleterious effects of morphine. In 1885, he registered Pemberton's French wine coca nerve tonic. That's a mouthful. The following year, he introduced a non-alcoholic version, which is what we know today as Coca-Cola. And it was marketed, here again, as a temperance drink. It was sold in Atlanta in a pharmacy, and Pemberton's partner, Frank Robinson, actually named it Coca-Cola, and he's the one that designed this script. And that script is trademarked to this day. Originally, it was marketed as a temperance drink and a patent medicine, and it was supposedly a cure for morphine addiction and impotence. The name Coca-Cola refers to its two original ingredients, coca leaves and cola nuts, which are a source of caffeine. So the first bottling plant was opened in 1894 in Vicksburg, Mississippi. And from 1886 to 1956, the price was fixed at 5 cents. That's an interesting story. And we see some of the original bottles. And we see how the brand, the logo, Coca-Cola, remains the same throughout. Dr. Pepper. In 1885, it was created by Charles Alderton in Waco, Texas. And this is interesting. He created a drink that smelled like the drugstore. I'm going, I don't know what the drugstore smelled like, but so originally the drink was simply called Waco. So the origin of the Dr. Pepper name is unknown. It does not really have a connection with anyone named Dr. Pepper, although there are some myths that do surround the name. It was introduced at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, and early advertising, it aids in the digestion, restores vim, vigor, and vitality. And supposedly there was a 1920 study that showed people's energy drops around 10, 2, and 4. So that's where the marketing campaign came about. You needed to drink a Dr. Pepper at 10, 2, and 4. You'll notice at the top of the slide that when I refer to Dr. Pepper, there's no period after doctor. Up until the 1950s, there was, but it was dropped in the 1950s. And here we see one of the original advertisements that it do include the period. The healthful, thirst-quenching, satisfying, free from caffeine. Pepsi. It was created in 1893 in New Bern, North Carolina, and Mr. Bradham used his own name and he named it Brad's Drink. It was renamed Pepsi, Pepsi-Cola, in 1898 because it had digestive benefits relieving dyspepsia. So Pepsi. In 1923, the company had to declare bankruptcy because during World War I, sugar was rationed and sugar prices fluctuated so much that it forced them out of business. It was later purchased by the Loft Candy Company, and they purchased it solely to sell at soda fountains. It gained popularity during the Depression because instead of the 8-ounce bottle, they introduced a 12-ounce bottle, but it still sold for only a nickel. And we see how their logo has changed over the years. Seven Up was invented by Mr. Gregg in St. Louis in 1929, and it was originally named Bib Label Lithiated Lemon Lime Soda. That's a mouthful. The name was changed in 1936 to 7 Up because it recounted the 7 ingredients in the soda's chemical balance, its pH, and the atomic mass for lithium is 7. So 7 Up. It contained lithium citrate until 1948. And that was a mood stabilizing drug. So if you drank 7 Up, you became mellow. And we see some of their advertising. So where do we find information about pharmacists, apothecaries who worked in the soda industry and what kinds of work that they did? We turn to our normal genealogical information in the census, directories and membership lists. Newspapers also have a lot of information. And we have our regional museums, genealogical societies, historical centers, and historical societies that have a lot of information about it, especially those prior to the 1850 census. Check these out to see if one of your relatives might have been involved in this industry. We see Wakefield's blackberry balsam. And who was Mr. Wakefield? He was Sylvanus Wakefield, who advertised himself in the 1850 census as a doctor. He was actually a Bloomington, Indiana huckster who produced 11 patent medicines, including the Wakefield's blackberry balsam. He called himself a doctor, but had no formal training in medicine. And he used his printing company to advertise his products. And by the 1880s, he had a well-established factory. So we see that he starts as a doctor in 1850, in 1860. He's in medicine manufacturing, and he goes on into the 1880s, where he is a very substantial medicine manufacturer. Look at those numbers going from 2,000 to 33,000 and 10,000 to 85,000. Significant. Here is Mr. Helmbold, Henry Helmbold. He was a Philadelphia druggist who became wealthy from his diuretic extract of bushu. In 1860 census and the 1865 passport applications, we see that he's doing patent medicine, but on his passport application, he claims he's a medical doctor. He goes on in 1870 to own a drugstore, and by 1880, he's doing so well that he's just a gentleman. So we move forward into 1910, and we see for the first time we've got our medicine show people. We see the Altons and the Paffins. Howard and Sheila he's a showman, she's an actress. The Paffins are both jugglers in a medicine show. 1920, we see Edwin Griffin and Frank Emerson, excuse me, and they're performers and a magician in a medicine show. Also in 1920, we have Dan Price, and he's working at a soda fountain. So we see that transition from the medicine shows to the actual drug store where they have a soda fountain. In 1940, we have Alfred Smith, and he's a soda clerk in a retail drugstore. 1950, we have Norma Allen, and she is a soda jerker in a retail drugstore. Do you know where the term soda jerk comes from? It's actually the action of pulling or jerking the handle on the soda fountain with the carbonated water to dispense it. So therefore, a soda jerk. And here we have Edward Johnston, and he's a truck driver for a soda pop company. So we see the evolution from apothecaries moving forward. But let's go backwards again. And we have a Mason membership card that shows that James Gordon was an apothecary in the 1860s up to maybe the 1880s. We have New York State employment cards and peddler's licenses. And we see Edward Hetz is a pharmacist. First, he's an assistant pharmacist, and then a pharmacist. This is in the 1893 to 1901 time frame. Harry Mason, a pharmacist and photographer in 1895. And surprisingly enough, there are application papers from the National Association of the Boards of Pharmacy. This is a multi-page report for Douglas Robinson that gives his high school education, his pharmacy college training that he has received, the practical experience before licensing, the practical experience after licensing, as well as other qualifications for his pharmacy license. And in it, we also have his college certificate, a certificate of registration and grades, and his moral character, one of the final pages. So it's interesting to see what was required of a 20th century pharmacist, and still today. We have California State Board of Pharmacy records, where simply a listing of all the pharmacists, and it has their certificate numbers on them. So there might be some further documentation behind this record. These were some of the more interesting stories. We have Dr. Welsh. We don't have exactly a time frame, but I quote from his advertisement in 1810 of drugs for sale, given in Edgar's Pioneer Life. And it's a whole list of yellow bark, oil of vitriol, verdigris, elixir paregoric, etc. famous worm medicine purchased by the King of France. So we're talking well before the 1850 census, where Dr. Welsh might have been enumerated. And we see that he is claiming to be both a medical and a divinity doctor. This one from the Civil War era, John Goddard. He studied medicine, but owing to poor health, he began a business as an apothecary. And the interesting story is he obtained a position as a surgeon on an armed vessel. He started to go to Spain to buy his stock because the war, the Revolutionary War, prevented him from getting it in England. On the way, the vessel was captured by the British and all the officers taken as prisoners to the West Indies. Here, he almost died with fever and became so thin that when he was convalescent, he crawled out through a porthole of the prison ship and swam to a vessel bound for the United States. Just before this vessel reached home, it was captured, and he was again a prisoner on the very ship from which he had escaped. He finally did recover, return home, and he got there on a Sunday morning and found all the family at church except his mother, who was utterly overcome with joy at seeing her son again. So, Revolutionary War time frame. We see Mr. Dorr, a druggist, in 1796, and alone in 1801. So very early recounting. William Joseph, how he educated. He settled in Hartford in 1757. So if you have anyone that you suspect might have been an apothecary, a druggist, medicine man of some sort, early on, some of these annals and other documents will give you really, really great information. Here's a medical doctor from New York, and similarly, his education, and he opened a wholesale drug business. Military veterans cards, their place of enlistment, but also their job. He was a druggist, as was Mr. Meacham. And we have more recent military World War II cards that show that people were working for actual soda works. Mr. Pettigrew for the Iowa Soda Products Company. And that's a picture of the Iowa Soda Products Company. So there are lots of opportunities to find information for your potential pharmacist, alchemist, a chemist. So don't overlook the idea of sodas and see if someone in your family might not have been involved in this occupation. So I will turn it over to Jessica.
Thank you, Terri. That was really interesting. We don't have any questions from our online participants, but I do have a question for you. You had mentioned in 1820 that the pharmacopoeia was established to help create some guidelines and standards. Was that a government effort, or who was organizing that?
I think it was an independent effort at the time. There were quite a number of people in Philadelphia, in the Philadelphia area, especially with the hospital being the first one to almost 70 years earlier to start a pharmacy. And they wanted to ensure that across the board that they had some form of training and some guidelines for their particular practice. So yes, I believe it was an independent, it was not a government agency.
Yeah. Well, thank goodness somebody started paying closer attention over the years. Some of those scenarios weren't great. One last closing thought, just kind of a side note, talking about Alka-Seltzer. I remember when I was in college, I was a business major, and in a marketing class, I remember learning about the marketing of Alka-Seltzer, and that they had typically been taking one tablet, and their marketing team decided to come up with this little jingle of plop, plop, fizz, fizz, and essentially doubled their sales by doing that. They understood that there wasn't any problem with taking two, and it worked. So, anyways, thank you. Thanks all for being here, and we hope to see you next month for weather. Just wait, it'll change. August 9th, 9 a.m. Thank you.